I'm much too fast to take that test. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. You wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. There's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time.
Okay, that's the intro. Political and economic changes in the UK. Some of this is going to seem redundant from the student given presentations on the UK, but there's some stuff when it comes to political and economic changes with the United Kingdom that we have to make sure that we have and understand and have a good explanation of. So here we go. Okay, so we're going to start really with collective consensus. That's what that says up there. I know it's kind of cut off, but you can see it. Collective consensus, which was the push after World War II to have all political parties agree that there should be a rebuilding of the economy through working to narrow the gap between people that had a lot and between the poor. So some things that we're going to see during the collective consensus is that all parties are going to agree that there needs to be an establishment of a welfare state. And in this case, a welfare state means to provide the citizens with things like old age pensions, health care, unemployment insurance, and housing assistance and food assistance. One of the major programs that was established under collective consensus was the National Health Service in 1948. And this is where you have the nationalization of healthcare, so insurance and hospitals were run by the government as opposed to private companies. And the state in general took responsibility for economic growth and maintaining full employment at this time. So again, it's collective consensus because everybody agreed that providing a welfare state and make sure that everybody has health insurance and is taken care of was a good idea for economic growth. And that's the case until about Margaret Thatcher and the push for neoliberalism neoliberalist economic policy. So from 1979 to 1990, Margaret Thatcher is the conservative prime minister. And we'll see this throughout the globe. We've seen it in Mexico. We saw it in Nigeria, where there was economic hardship in the late 70s. And Margaret Thatcher is going to blame the economic hardship on the socialist-style policies of that collective consensus era. So providing a welfare state kind of undermines people's initiative to work hard and do better for themselves, which is going to stagnate economic growth. Margaret Thatcher pushed economic policy to return to more free market forces. So you're going to see a privatization of more industries. You're going to see that price controls are going to be replaced by market economic policies. You're going to have cutting of taxes and deregulations, cutting of regulations or deregulation on businesses so businesses can reinvest in growing their companies. You're going to have a cutback on social welfare programs, and this is where Margaret Thatcher got the nickname the Milk Snatcher, because she took away a very popular program that provided milk to all households with children in the UK. She became tough on labor unions, and all of these policies is kind of how she became known as the Ronald Reagan of the UK, because these are kind of some of the things that you're going to see in the United States with like deregulation of business, cutting taxes, the whole like trickle down economic theory. So her policies are really going to reflect neoliberalism. And just to remember what neoliberalism is, it's a revival of the classic liberal values that promote free market competition amongst business, including reducing government regulation so businesses don't have to spend more money on following government rules, and cutting social spending. Then we're going to usher in Tony Blair. And Tony Blair, there's Prime Minister in between Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, but we're just going to focus on jumping ahead to Tony Blair. He is what is going to be called, he's the head of the New Labour Party. Okay, his main push with political change was devolution to Scotland and Wales. He also was responsible for helping negotiate the Good Friday Agreement, which was the agreement between Northern Ireland and London, where there would be a peace from violence from the separatists in Northern Ireland, as long as Northern Ireland could have devolved power. So remember that devolution or devolved power is when your national government agrees to allow smaller subnational governments some control and sovereignty over local policy-making decisions. Tony Blair also agreed that there should be an elected mayor and a council for London, so the people of London could vote in a mayor for the first time and a council to represent them. The hereditary peers power, so remember the hereditary peers are the people that are in the House of Lords because they inherited it from their father or their parents. They lost their voting rights, so it would be a little bit more democratic. He is going to incorporate the Convention on Human Rights into British law, so that is not going to be popular with people who are Eurosceptics or people who don't want Britain to have to follow necessarily a supranational government organization. Now, one thing that makes it new labor is that the original Labour Party, they were really tied closely to incorporating labor unions into government policy and policy-making decisions. So what Tony Blair does is he seeks out to separate the Labour Party's connection with the socialist policies and the labor union policies. So that's what makes it new from the typical platform of the Labour Party, or what historically the Labour Party has been about. So gets rid of Clause 4 of the Labour Party's constitution, which says that the Labour Party is going to be socialist, and kind of separates that idea of socialism from the Labour Party. And he passed the Freedom of Information Act in 2000. Here is some cards, and this says Scottish Labour Party, but it's kind of the same thing that the Labour Party was pushing all throughout the UK. So education was a big policy driver for Tony Blair. Keeping the National Health Service, trying to get as many people employed as possible, and devolution of power, really the keys to the New Labour Party's manifesto. Okay, after Tony Blair, because Tony Blair wasn't popular because he supported George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, he's out, and David Cameron, a Conservative Party member, becomes Prime Minister. It is not present. I'm going to fix that real quick. Alright, I fixed that, so I didn't want that mistake to be hanging out there. So David Cameron, the Conservative Party Prime Minister, begins his reign in 2010. he took the Conservative Party in a more mainstream direction, meaning not so much of that Thatcherism. So he did have a hung parliament, which means he didn't have a majority, and he had to find a different political party to form a coalition with. So remember, hung parliament is when no party has a majority of seats in the parliament. And he picked the Liberal Democratic Party to form a coalition. So this is Nick Clegg, the head of the the head of the Liberal Democratic Coalition. And he became what's called like the deputy prime minister. So he was the head of the smaller party, and together those two parties, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, formed Her Majesty's government. So, what did they do as a coalition? Well, they had a policy push called Big Society, and Big Society focused on empowering citizens to take control of their lives instead of relying on government social welfare programs to take care of them. I'm trying to figure out why this graph is upside down. Hold on one second. Okay, that was fun. I think my computer was possessed, but it's fixed. Okay, so Big Society is going to cut back on social welfare spending. And again, that whole devolution of power. So instead of the Parliament in London making all of the decisions, you're going to hand over some sovereignty and power to local regions or subnational governments. So part of the Big Society and cutting back of the government spending is instituting austerity programs. And austerity is something that we've seen in Mexico and Nigeria as well. And that's when you reduce the amount of public spending. And that's what I was trying to show you in this graph. So we have it during World War II, and then you're talking about a rebuilding, and you have to also fund a military during World War II. Okay, so there's a spike in spending. And then you have collective consensus, so there's going to be increase in spending as you have social welfare programs like unemployment insurance and the National Health Service. Okay, and then you have Thatcher coming in to power, and you have cuts. Okay, you have Tony Blair. There's a little bit of increase in spending, and then here is the Lib Dem coalition. And you're going to see that the UK spending starts to get cut again. So this is where we would institute austerity programs, and there's a decrease in public spending. Again, as said before, you're trying to reduce the welfare state, reduce how much the UK government is spending in contrast to how much money it is bringing in through tax revenue. And this austerity is going to affect the National Health Service, welfare programs, and education, especially university education. And when we talk about social movements, we'll talk about the people's response to these cuts in these very popular public welfare programs. Okay. And that is it for political change and economic change.